The girl collapsed into the dust like a wounded bird, her buckskin dress torn and streaked with blood. Elias Boone reined in his mare with a quiet pull. He sat motionless in the saddle, boots dusted red by the dying light of an Arizona evening. For a moment, neither man nor horse moved. Only the wind whispered through the low brush, and the buzzards circled overhead like dark prayers unanswered. He could have passed her by. Lord knew he had passed plenty before, some too far gone, others too tangled in someone else's mess. But something about the girl held him. Maybe it was the way her fingers still clenched around a small deerskin pouch, even in unconsciousness. Or the way the land seemed to hold its breath around her, like it knew what was at stake. The shadows lengthened across Apache Pass as Elias dismounted. His joints cracked, old bones remembering harder years. He walked toward her slowly, boots crunching on gravel, one hand near his belt, never too far from the worn grip of his revolver. He knelt beside her, the scent of sun-baked earth and blood heavy in his lungs. She was no more than 15, maybe younger, skin the color of river-washed stone, her black hair tangled with dust. Her breathing was shallow, her lips cracked. A dark stain spread from her left shoulder gunshot. From the look of it, recent. He pressed 2 fingers to her neck. Weak pulse. Still alive. Elias sighed. Not a sound of relief more, a weary surrender. He unhooked his canteen, lifted her head gently, and let the water touch her lips. She didn't stir. He poured a bit onto a cloth and wiped the grime from her brow, revealing a smudge of war paint barely visible beneath the blood and sweat. "Apache, God help me," he muttered, glancing to the horizon. "What have you walked into, girl?" His mare, Luna, shifted restlessly. There was tension in the air, something coming. Elias had felt it before, in other lands, under other suns, just before the first bullet tore the quiet apart. He looked down at the girl again. Leaving her here meant she'd die. Taking her in meant trouble. That was the kind of math that had no clean answer. He rose, bent low, and carefully lifted her into his arms. She was feather-light, more bone than flesh. He set her sideways across the saddle, climbed up behind, and nudged Luna westward, toward the box canyon where his cabin crouched between old sycamores like a secret. The ride home was quiet. The kind of silence that feels thick with questions. Elias didn't pray, hadn't in years, but a verse from his long-closed Bible crept into his mind uninvited. "Be not forgetful to entertain strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares." He shook it off. He wasn't entertaining an angel. He was hauling a half-dead Apache child who might bring every ghost of the territory down on his head. Still, he didn't ride faster. The moment had settled inside him like an ache. By the time the cabin came into view, dusk had turned to night. A pale moon rose over the Chiricahua Range, casting the land in silver and sorrow. Elias swung down, carried the girl inside, and laid her on a pile of buffalo hides near the hearth. He lit the oil lamp, its flicker chasing shadows into corners. Then he stood there, just looking at her, as if waiting for her to vanish. She didn't. And so, with slow, practiced hands, Elias Boone began the work of tending to her wound, same as he'd done for dying soldiers in wars. No one remembered anymore. Except this time, it was different. This time, the war might come to him. She stirred in the early dark, when the cabin was still, and the fire little more than glowing coals. Elias had dozed in the chair by the hearth, rifle across his lap out of habit more than fear. When he opened his eyes, she was watching him, not with alarm. Not quite, but with the cautious stillness of a creature who's been hunted before. He set the rifle down slow, palms open. "You're safe," he said, voice low as the wind outside. "You're in my home." Her eyes flicked around the cabin bare walls, shelves lined with tools and jars, a blanket draped over a worn Bible. She didn't speak, but her hand, trembling, moved to the pouch still tied at her waist. Elias didn't stop her. He crossed to the stove, poured hot water into a tin cup, added willow bark and peppermint. "Drink. It'll ease the pain." She didn't take it at first. Then, with a movement like a decision too heavy for her age, She reached and sipped. Her lips cracked further, but she didn't wince, just stared at the fire, eyes far older than her face. "What's your name?" he asked after a while. She hesitated. Then, so softly he almost missed it, "Nalin." "I'm Elias," he replied. Silence again. But it wasn't hostile. As dawn crept in through the slats, Elias changed her bandages. The wound was clean, but deep. Whoever fired had meant to kill. The bullet had missed her heart by inches. He didn't ask questions. Not yet. He just worked washing, binding, propping her up with rolled blankets. Her skin was hot. Fever hadn't broken yet. He made a note to dig out the jar of prickly pear sap, something his late wife had sworn by. It was when he stepped out to draw water that it hit him, the scent in the air. Smoke, distant but real. Elias scanned the ridge. There, far off, a thin trail rising skyward, too narrow for lightning, too clean for accident. Someone was out there. He returned with water and set the bucket by the stove. Nalin watched him closely now, not fearfully, more like she was weighing something. Finally, she said, "They're looking for me." He didn't flinch. "Why?" She stared into the steam rising from her cup. "Because I saw. Because I ran." He said nothing, just waited. "They killed the boy," she whispered. "He was one of them, white, but he tried to stop it. They shot him, and then they burned the camp." Elias felt something shift in his chest. "What camp?" "South of Apache Pass," she said. "Families. Hiding." She didn't need to say more. He knew. The army had been running sweeps. Said they were rounding up stragglers, but Elias had heard the whispers about men like Calhoun Riggs, officers with grudges and no eyes watching. And now, this child, this half-grown witness, had slipped through. Nalin untied the pouch. From inside, she pulled a small, folded square of hide, unrolled it carefully. A hand-drawn map, crude, but detailed. A red mark, circled in ink that looked like it had bled through with rain. A depot? A cache? Elias Stared. He knew that canyon, and the route marked. He'd ridden it once, long ago, escorting Riggs himself during the dry wash campaign. Suddenly, it made sense. They weren't just chasing her because she'd seen. They were chasing what she carried. Proof. Elias exhaled slow. His cabin, his quiet, his worn solitude, they wouldn't hold against this. But the truth was, maybe they weren't meant to. Maybe all this time, the silence hadn't been safety. It had been hiding. He looked at the girl. She was watching him again. Not pleading. Just waiting for a choice. Elias Boone nodded once. "I reckon we better get ready." And if they'd burn a camp to silence her, what would they do to me? Before we dive into everything, let us know in the comments, where are you watching this video from? Connecting with viewers from all across the world has been a huge source of inspiration for us. The cabin was quiet in the days that followed, save for the low crackle of firewood and the occasional wind slipping through the shutter cracks like an old spirit come calling. Elias Boone moved through the space with careful rhythm, boiling water, tending to the fire, grinding herbs the way his wife once had. He spoke little, and Nalin spoke even less. The fever didn't break for 2 days. During that time, Elias watched over her, not like a guardian, more like a witness to something fragile that might vanish. He saw how she curled tighter into herself at night, how she flinched at distant sounds, how her fingers never fully released the leather pouch she carried even in sleep. He didn't ask questions. Not yet. She ate little, drank when prompted. Her eyes followed him around the room with a wary steadiness, but there was no hate in them, no fear either, just the deep suspicion of someone who'd learned the hard way that kindness often came with a price. On the third morning, she sat up, only halfway. But it was enough. "You fixed the bullet," she said quietly. Elias was washing a tin plate in the basin. He looked up. "Took it out, anyway. Rest is up to you." She nodded, then looked around the room again, slower this time. Her gaze lingered on the far wall where a small wooden cross hung crooked, half-shadowed by dust and years. "That your god?" she asked. Elias followed her eyes. His voice was rough. "Used to be." She didn't press, and he didn't explain. That night, as Nalin rested with a damp cloth on her forehead, Elias stepped out into the yard. The moon was a pale coin in the black, stretched sky. Coyotes howled far off. He took the moment to breathe, to feel the night, to remember. Behind him, the door creaked open. Light spilled from inside, and Nalin stood there, wrapped in a blanket, her silhouette small against the dark. "You don't sleep much," she said. "Used to be a scout," he replied, eyes still on the hills. Hard habit to break. She came to stand beside him. A long silence passed between them. Then she said, "You've lost people." He nodded. She didn't ask who. Didn't need to. In that stillness, Elias saw the echo of another night year's Agawin. Alma, his daughter, had stood right there, pointing at the same stars. She'd asked if heaven had roads like Arizona, or if souls had to ride bareback to find home. He swallowed hard. "You remind me of her," he said finally. "Was she Apache?" Nalin asked. He smiled faintly. "Half. Her mama was from Sonora, called herself neither white nor brown nor red, just woman, just strong." Nalin looked up at him, brow furrowed, like she wanted to ask something but thought better of it. Instead, she said, "The fever, it gave me dreams. I saw fire. I saw a canyon full of bones." Elias turned slowly. "That wasn't a dream," she added. "It was memory." She didn't elaborate. She didn't have to. They went back inside without another word. But something had shifted. The silence wasn't cold anymore. It had become something shared. Not yet trust, but the first bricks of it. That night, the fever returned. It crept into Nalin's body, like a thief unseen, but unmistakably there. Elias found her trembling beneath the blanket, lips dry, eyes half-lidded but unseeing. He checked the wound, no fresh bleeding, but the heat under her skin was sharp enough to make him curse under his breath. He rummaged through an old crate beneath the hearth, pulling out a bundle of dried herbs, narrow-leaf yucca root, sagebrush, and wild mint. It wasn't medicine the army would have used, but it was what Elenahi's wife had sworn by. That was enough. He crushed the herbs in a tin bowl, added boiling water, and set the steam near her face. Then he soaked a cloth, laid it across her neck, and waited. Outside, coyotes sang again. But it wasn't their song. Elias heard it was a bugle, a memory, a ghost. Dry wash, 1882. The sand was redder there, full of iron, full of blood. Elias had been 28, riding scout for Riggs and his damn fool pursuit of renegade Apaches. There were no warriors that day, only women, children, and 2 old men. He'd argued, said the trail was cold, that the camp was peaceful. Riggs ignored him. The orders were clear. When it was done, Elias walked through the smoke and ash, stepping over scorched baskets, burnt hides, and the body of a boyno, more than 12. His arms still wrapped around his little sister, trying to shield her. Both had died with eyes open. That image stayed. In sleep, in silence, in every fire he built since. Now, beside his own hearth, he watched Nalin shift again, sweat glistening on her forehead. She muttered something. Elias leaned closer. "Riggs," she whispered. "Don't let him. Ash, canyon. Bones, bones." His jaw clenched. She wasn't dreaming. Not just dreaming. She was remembering something too. He wiped her face gently, the way Elena used to wipe Alma's when fever took her. A gesture older than memory, older than war. Then he sat back and stared at the rafters. So it was Riggs, still out there, still cleaning his messes with bullets and lies. And somehow, this girl this too young survivor had slipped through his fingers with something he didn't want seen. Elias didn't need to know the details yet. The shape of the thing was enough. Riggs had done something again. Something bad enough to chase down a child and burn her memories from the land. And now that child was under his roof. By dawn, the fever eased. Nalin slept deeply, color returning to her cheeks. Elias stepped outside, shoulders heavy beneath the weight of memory. The wind smelled of dry mesquite and ash, Somewhere in the distance, something stirred the birds from the trees. A soft thunder, far off. It could have been cattle, but Elias Boone knew the rhythm of hoofbeats when they meant trouble. He spit into the dirt and muttered, "Damn you, Riggs. You just don't quit." Then he looked back at the cabin. Light peeked through the shutters. Inside, Hope slept in the form of a girl. Outside, war came riding again. The morning sun broke over the canyon rim like a slow revelation, washing the earth in gold and copper. Elias stood at the edge of the clearing, eyes fixed on the ridge above. He wasn't a man given to superstition, but something in the air felt wrong tight, as if the land itself was holding its breath. A vulture wheeled overhead, silent against the blue. Luna nickered from her lean-to, ears twitching toward the eastern slope. Elias crouched low, lifting a dry branch from the ground and snapping it clean in two. He tossed one half aside, kept the other in his palm, and used its ash to smudge over a reflection glinting off the cabin window. The light could catch a scout's eye, and Elias knew eyes were out there, watching. Waiting, he climbed the rocky rise behind the cabin, slow and careful. Years of old habits guided his steps, the way he stepped between loose stones, how he avoided silhouette. At the top, he laid flat against the rock and raised the old spyglass he kept wrapped in oilcloth. The glass was scratched, the brass tarnished, but it still worked, and what it showed made his stomach go cold. Smoke, not from his own chimney, not from any settler's cabin. A narrow, purposeful column, rising steady into the pale sky from the far ridge, maybe 3 miles off. Elias adjusted the lens, scanning for movement. For a long time, he saw nothing. Then, just before he lowered the glass, the brush shifted and a man stepped into view. He was too far to make out clearly, but Elias knew the posture. That military gait, that habit of checking the terrain every 5 steps. A scout, not cavalry blue, but riding light frontier rangers or mercs. Worse than soldiers, sometimes, not bound by code, just orders and coin. Elias backed away from the edge and slid down the slope, breathing through his nose. His boots hit dirt, and he walked briskly to the cabin, mind already working the problem. Inside, Nallen was awake. She sat propped against the far wall, her eyes clearer now, though rimmed with caution. She watched him closely, sensing the shift in his energy. "What is it?" she asked. He didn't answer at first. Instead, he moved to the far side of the hearth, bent low, and pulled back a woven rug. Beneath it, a section of floor gave slightly under pressure. He lifted the hatch, revealing a narrow crawl space lined with stone and old blankets. "You'll need to stay in here if they come," he said. "Don't speak. Don't move." She looked at the hole, then back at him. "They're close?" "They will be." Nallen swallowed, then nodded once. No panic, just resignation. Elias hated Thathow children like her, learned too young what running and hiding meant. He tossed her a half-filled canteen and a small pouch of jerky. She took them without question, and as she climbed into the hiding space, Elias caught a glimpse of the pouch still tied to her waist. The map, the secret, the fire they were all walking toward. Once the hatch was shut, Elias reset the rug and returned to the front door. He checked the rifle by the frame, loaded 3 shells into the chamber, and left it leaning where it would be closest if things turned bad fast. Then he went to the porch and sat down like any other man might, quiet, sun on his shoulders, a cup of coffee cooling beside him. But his eyes never left the tree line. He knew they were coming, and they would not be asking questions. The sun dipped behind the ridge by early evening, casting long shadows that reached across the land like the fingers of a sleeping giant. Inside the cabin, the hush deepened, broken only by the crackle of burning pinyon in the hearth and the occasional distant call of a mourning dove. Elias sat by the fire, his body still, but his mind in motion. Across the room, Nallen had emerged from the crawl space and now sat curled under the woolen blanket, legs drawn to her chest. Her eyes followed the flame's slow dance, as if reading something written in its glow. They hadn't spoken since the warning signs that morning. Elias had checked the trail twice, Since then, no fresh hoof prints, no smoke, no sound. But something told him the danger hadn't passed. It had just stepped back to study. He offered her a small wooden bowl of stew beans, bits of dried venison, a sliver of onion. She accepted with a nod. No words. Just that quiet understanding they'd begun to shape between them. They ate in silence for a while. Then, when the shadows had thickened and the fire turned amber, Elias leaned back against the wall and said, "My daughter used to sit right there." Nalin looked up. Her spoon paused midair. "She'd braid her mother's shawls into ropes," he continued. "Said she was practicing to lasso the moon. Said that if she could catch it, she'd make the night stay still. No more sunrise, no more goodbye." Nalin's expression didn't change, but her eyes softened slightly, the way light softens across water when the wind dies down. "What happened to her?" she asked. Elias took a long breath, not heavy, just steady. "Fevers came through one winter, fast, like wolves. Took her and her mama 3 days apart. Nothing I did helped. Nothing the preacher tried either. After they passed, I left town, rode out here, built this place with my hands. Figured the silence would be easier than the echo of." For a while, Nalin said nothing. The fire shifted. A log settled with a muffled thud. Then she reached into the folds of her blanket and drew out a small beaded cord turquoise and bone threaded around a bit of hide. She held it out. "This belonged to my sister," she said. "She died in Ash Canyon. I wore hers. She wore mine." Elias looked at it but didn't touch. "You keep it," he said softly. She nodded, then tucked it back into the blanket folds. "My people say that when you share a story with someone, they carry a part of your shadow, and you carry part of theirs. That way, even when the sun goes down, you're not alone." He looked at her then not as a child, not as a burden, but as someone who understood the things silence couldn't hide. He nodded. "Your people are right." That night, before she slept, Nalin took the pouch from around her waist and placed it near her side, no longer clenched tightly in her fingers. Elias noticed, but said nothing. He simply banked the fire, locked the door, and sat one more hour by the hearth, watching the embers dim. The shadows didn't feel quite so empty now, and in that dim, warm stillness, something old and heavy in Elias Boone's soul shifted just enough to let the first light of trust inside. Morning came with a hard wind that rattled the shutters and brought dust into the seams of the cabin's walls. Elias rose before first light, the way he always had. Years in the saddle had taught him that the hour before dawn was the only time a man could think clearly, before the world remembered its violence. He stepped outside, scanned the horizon. Still quiet, no smoke today. But that didn't ease the coil in his gut. When he came back in, Nalin was awake. She sat at the small table, arms folded, the leather pouch resting between her hands like something sacred or dangerous. She looked up as he entered, then down again at the pouch. "I need to show you something," she said. He didn't reply, just nodded and pulled a stool beside her. With fingers more careful than fearful, she untied the string and drew out a square of hide creased, water-stained, but still legible. She spread it across the table, smoothing it flat. Elias leaned forward. It wasn't just a map. It was a confession drawn in ink and instinct. Canyon lines etched with precision. Ridge markers. Creek beds. He recognized the terrain stretch of land between Apache Pass and the old mail route, somewhere near Coyote Gulch. A place long abandoned, left off most new army dispatches. But this map had something those dispatches didn't. A red mark. Not just a symbol. A cipher. Someone had circled a crevice on the north wall of the canyon, added 3 slashes beside it, and written a name. Depot 7. Elias frowned. "Depot 7, he repeated. "That's not Army protocol." It's not supposed to exist," Nalin said. "My uncle worked there. Said it was where they kept things off the books. Ammunition, records, sometimes people." Her voice caught slightly, but she didn't falter. "After the raid in Ash Canyon, they burned the village. But before that, He gave this to my sister. Told her to run. She didn't make it. I did. Elias sat back. His mind raced through pieces of a puzzle he didn't know he'd been holding. He remembered Riggs complaining about loose ends, how sometimes supplies vanished before they were logged, how he once bragged that ghost depots were the best way to handle unofficial solutions. Now it made sense. Ash Canyon hadn't just been a relocation sweep. It was a cover. Someone had been hiding something, maybe even testing something, and the people living there had seen too much. This map, Elias said slowly. It's proof. Nalin nodded. Enough to make them hunt me to the ends of the desert. He tapped the circled mark. We could take this to Fort Bowie. There's still good men there. Men who care what the army's doing in its own name. But getting there, she trailed off, eyes flicking toward the shuttered window. Elias stood. I know a route. Old trading path cuts through high rock, avoids the crossings. If we ride hard, we can make it in 2 days. Nalin didn't smile, but she did something more telling. She pushed the map toward him, no longer clutching it like a lifeline. It was trust, handed over in rough hide and careful ink. Elias folded the map and slid it inside his jacket. Then he checked the rifle, loaded the saddlebags with jerky, water, and spare cartridges. He worked without hurry, but without waste, the way a man moves when he knows time's against him. As he cinched the saddle on Luna, he paused. You ever ride a Mustang? He asked. Nalin came out, hair tied back, pouch at her belt once more. No, she said, climbing up behind him, but I learned fast. The stars above the cabin blazed cold and clear, uncaring of the human weight pressing into the world below. Elias sat on the porch steps, his rifle across his knees again, his eyes fixed not on the darkness, but on the faint eastward shimmer hinting at morning. Time was slipping, and the rhythm of hoofbeats still echoed in his blood, even if the riders had long gone. Riggs would be back. That much was certain. Behind him, the door creaked open softly. Nalin stepped out, wrapped in Elias's spare coat. She moved slowly, but her steps were steadier now. The fever was gone, but something heavier remained in her bones. War did that to a person even if they hadn't picked up a rifle. You're leaving, she said quietly. Elias didn't answer right away. He reached down, picked up a strip of leather he'd been braiding between his fingersawn old habit from the trail. We're leaving, he corrected. She sat beside him, eyes scanning the same horizon. You don't have to. Elias let out a short breath, almost a laugh, but it didn't carry joy. I reckon I do. Man doesn't get to sit quiet while wolves circle his door and pretend he's still innocent. They sat in silence for a moment longer. Finally, Elias stood. We'll ride light. No fire. No stops till the split ridge. If we're lucky, we'll reach the Copper Wash by midday. He went to the shed and returned with Luna already saddled. He packed only what they needed: jerky, water, the map. Everything else could burn, if it came to that. Nalin climbed up behind him, her arms light around his waist. She didn't ask questions. That's how Elias knew she understood the weight of the next miles better than most grown men he'd known. The sky behind them paled from indigo to slate. The first breath of dawn stretched across the Dragoon Mountains like a hand reaching for something lost. Elias turned back once to look at the cabin. Smoke still drifted faintly from the chimney, a thin thread of memory against the morning air. It had been a place of solitude, penance, maybe even cowardice. But tonight, it had become something more: the line in the sand. He urged Luna forward, and hooves whispered across dry earth. Southward, toward the pass, toward Fort Bowie, toward reckoning. The road ahead would not be kind. Elias knew the terrain: narrow canyons, watchful shadows, places where an ambush could bloom like wildfire. Riggs would try to cut them off before the old Spanish waterline. It was the last choke point before Army jurisdiction resumed. But Elias Boone was done hiding, done pretending the war inside him had ended just because the guns had gone silent. Beside the wind and the pounding of his heart, one thought repeated itself over and over like a prayer, like a vow. If she had the courage to run, I have the damn duty to see her through. And with that, the mountain behind them faded into the past, and the rising sun lit the trail ahead. The sun had fully breached the canyon rim by the time they passed the last stand of ironwood trees. Behind them, the land felt quiet in a way that wasn't Peacemoor like the hush before a storm. Ahead lay Copperwash, a dry riverbed carved by centuries of rain that hadn't fallen in years. It was the last unclaimed stretch before the boundary where law began to mean something again. Elias kept Luna close to the shade, scanning every ridge and gully. He'd ridden these paths before, but never with this kind of weight at his back, and never with a girl whose life might unravel the lies of men like Riggs. Nalin clung tighter as they crested a hill, the trail narrowing into sandstone and gravel. Below, the wash waited silent, sun-baked, and somewhere within it, the war was about to begin. The wash spread wide and barren before them, a ribbon of pale dust and fractured stone, framed by steep banks dotted with mesquite. Elias pulled Luna to a stop at the ridgeline, scanning the bends and gullies below. His gut clenched not from fear, but recognition. This place was too still. No birds, no wind, just the hush of waiting. He slid from the saddle, boots sinking slightly in the gravel. "We walk from here," he said over his shoulder. Nalin nodded, slipping down carefully. She tucked the map deeper into her belt as Elias tied Luna's reins loosely to a creosote bush. The horse snorted, uneasy, sensing what they both felt. They descended in silence, footsteps swallowed by the dry sand. Elias's eyes flicked left, right, up the banks, old soldier's eyes. Every outcropping was a possible muzzle flash, every shadow a waiting rifle. Then came the whistle, soft. 3 notes, almost like bird song, but not quite. He turned sharply too late. The first shot cracked the silence like thunder. Dust exploded beside his boot. He shoved Nalin hard, both of them diving behind a shelf of rock. Another shot rang out, this one biting into the stone above them, sending shards raining down. "Ridge," Elias shouted, peering through a gap. He saw movement 2 figures up top, rifles trained. Not army, Riggs's men, mercenaries playing war for coin and silence. Nalin clutched the rock beside him, wide-eyed but silent. No scream, no panic. Just that same stubborn fire that had carried her across deserts and graves. Elias unslung his rifle and drew a breath, slow and measured. Then he rose, just enough to fire 1 clean shot. The crack echoed, and one of the shadows jerked back, falling from the ridge with a thud that sounded too human for comfort. The second man ducked away. "We move," Elias barked, grabbing Nalin's hand. They sprinted low, darting between scrub and rock. More shots came, wild now, rushed. The ambush had failed. Riggs had underestimated Boone's instinct and the girl's grit. They reached the far side of the wash, scrambling up a narrow deer path as gravel slipped beneath their boots. At the top, Elias paused just long enough to scan the trail ahead, east, toward the stone arches. He turned to Nalin, breath sharp. "We don't stop again. Not till we hit the waterline." She nodded, hair whipping in the wind, dust streaking her cheeks. Behind them, a rising cloud of dust warned that riders were already in pursuit. Elias set his jaw. "This ends today. And with the sun burning high and the truth tied to the girl's hip, they ran it away from the fight, but straight into it. They moved like shadows, thrown long by the late sun-swift, quiet, determined. The land around them narrowed into rocky corridors, flanked by brittle cliffs. This was no trail for wagons or armies, just a forgotten fissure through the earth, known only to those who once hunted antelope and ghosts. Elias led the way, rifle slung but ready, boots slipping on shale. His mind mapped every outcropping, every crevice. He had ridden these high trails as a younger man, when he still believed the world could be measured in borders and orders. Now it was just survival. And Nalin. She followed without complaint. No wasted breath, no hesitation. That impressed him more than he cared to admit. Behind them, the echo of hooves came again closer now. 3, maybe 4 riders. Riggs wouldn't be far behind. He'd never let someone like Elias defy him and disappear, not with a witness in tow. Elias turned up a fork in the rock, a steep switchback that led toward a split ravine known only to old scouts and mountain lions. As they climbed, the path grew treacherous narrow enough that a wrong step meant a 30-foot fall. Halfway up, Nalin stumbled. He caught her arm just in time, pulling her tight against the cliffside. For a moment, their eyes met wide but unflinching. "You all right?" he asked, voice low. She nodded. "Keep going." So they did. At the top, the terrain opened again, revealing the stone Arcastwind slabs of ancient sandstone eroded into gate-like shapes by wind and time. To those who didn't know better, it looked like a dead end. But Elias knew the narrow gap behind the right arch led to a concealed basin, a spring. A last breath of cover. They ducked through the arch as the first rifle crack echoed above them. Stone shattered inches from Elias's shoulder. He shoved Nalin through the narrow gap, followed close behind, and rolled to the basin floor. Dust rose. A second shot rang out, skimming the top of the stone. Then quiet. They crouched behind a shelf of red rock, hearts pounding. Above, the riders reined in. Elias heard muttered voices. One shouted, "You see them?" Another replied, "Gone through the rocks, dam holes too tight for horses. Apache, we go round." The hoofbeats faded westward. Elias waited a beat longer, then turned to Nalin. "They'll circle. Won't take them long to find the far path." She wiped sweat from her brow. "Then we don't wait." He nodded. They had one more canyon to cross. Then the dry river that marked the edge of Army patrol zones. Beyond that lay Fort Bowie and the possibility of justice. But Elias knew Riggs wasn't done. He'd taste blood before he tasted shame. And he was closing in fast. As they slipped back into motion, Elias touched the ridge of his hat and muttered, half to himself, "Next ridge is the last." He didn't say last what, but he knew. The basin beneath the stone arches held a quiet that was older than war. Wind carved gentle sighs across the rock walls, and the spring burbled faintly through a crack in the earth cold. Clear, eternal. Elias hadn't planned to stop, but their breaths were ragged, and the path ahead climbed harder. A pause now might mean a faster run later. He filled the canteen and handed it to Nalin. She drank in silence, eyes fixed on the arch above, its jagged silhouette cut against the noon sky like a warning or a promise. "They say the Apache used to call this place the Whispering Gate," Elias said softly. "Said if you passed through it and lied, the desert would bury your bones where no kin could find them." Nalin looked at him, then back at the stone. "Do you believe that?" "I believe some lies need burying," he answered. They sat for a moment, catching breath in the cool shadow. The wind carried faint sounds, far-off hoofbeats, maybe, or just ghosts in the rocks. Elias checked his rifle again, then glanced at her belt. "The map. You still got it?" She tapped the pouch. "Tied to my skin." He nodded, satisfied, then paused. "When I was 20, I rode with a unit chasing Geronimo. We were told it was duty, told they were savages. First time I saw a burnt village, the kind with dolls melted into ash and bones too small to be dearie, told myself it had to be done. Kept telling myself." He didn't expect a response, just needed to say it. Nalin surprised him. "My father used to say shame only has power if you give it silence." He met her eyes dark and still, like the water beside them. Before he could reply, a faint whistle floated down the canyon. Not wind. Elias stood instantly. "Time's up." They slipped out the back of the basin, following a goat path that cut tight along a ledge. Elias kept his body between her and the open air, every step measured. Below, the land fell away into thorn brush and shallea place no cavalry would willingly follow. But Riggs wasn't cavalry anymore. He was hunger dressed as law. As they climbed the final slope, Fort Bowie's distant flagpole appeared over the ridgeline, still far, but real. "We're close," Elias said. Then a gunshot rang out. Stone exploded near Nalin's feet. She stumbled, cried out, but didn't fall. Elias dropped to one knee, scanning the ridge behind. Riggs, not just him. 3 riders, rifles raised, racing the long arc of the canyon rim. Nalin scrambled behind a boulder. Elias ducked next to her, jaw clenched. "Next ridge," he muttered again. "That's where this ends." And for the first time, she didn't ask what he meant. The ridge fell away into a wide basin of cracked earth and dry river stone, the old Spanish waterline. Once a shallow tributary, now a graveyard of thirsty cottonwoods and buried secrets. The border of Fort Bowie's patrol zone lay just beyond, but it may as well have been 100 miles. Elias and Nolan burst over the ridge, boots sliding through dust. The land offered no cover now, just open sky and the distant glint of the old depot shed, abandoned since the last supply run months ago. "They'll cut us off," Nolan gasped. Elias scanned the high ground behind them, Riggs and his men already cresting the slope. "Too close." "No," he said. "We hold them here." He turned toward the depot, pulling Nolan behind the half-rotted wall. It leaned like an old, drunk but offered shade-end a place to dig in. Nolan crouched low, unrolling the map and flattening it against the dirt floor. Elias knelt beside her. His finger traced the marks inked in Navajo script and U.S. military shorthand. This wasn't just a record of stolen supply caches. It was a ledger of betrayal, places where treaties were broken, where promises died. "You understand what this is?" he asked. She nodded. "It's proof." Elias looked up, eyes narrowing as Riggs and 2 riders approached on foot, rifles raised. They moved slowly, deliberately. No shouting now. No need. They had the numbers, the range. Then Riggs's voice called out, "Boone, don't make this uglier than it has to be." Elias stood, rifle ready. "You already made it ugly, Riggs." The man laughed, a dry sound, bitter with dust. "You think the Army's gonna care what that girl says? What she's carrying? Hell, they paid us to clean this mess up. I'm doing their work." "You're doing your own," Elias said. "Same as always." A long pause. Riggs stepped forward, unafraid. "You could walk away from this, Boone. Nobody needs to know. Hand her over. Walk away." Elias stepped out fully, rifle still at his side. Not aimed. Not yet. "You remember Dragoon Flats?" he asked. "Little boy, 9 years old, burned holding his mother's hand." Riggs flinched. "You told me to forget it," Elias continued. "Said it was a cost of peace." "War's messy," Riggs snapped. "You knew that." "I didn't know I was following a butcher." The silence that followed was thick with dust and regret. Riggs raised his rifle. "So be it." But Elias was faster. His shot struck Riggs square in the shoulder, spinning him backward. One of the riders fired blindly. The other ducked. Elias ducked back behind the wall, reloading with shaking fingers. Nalin pulled the pouch from her belt. "I run now," she said, "while they're distracted." He looked at her, saw the steadiness there, the fire. "No," he said. "We run together." And with one final breath, they burst from cover and into the storm. Gunfire lit the basin like dry lightning, sudden, blinding, without warning. Elias and Nalin darted between sagebrush and stone, the air cracking with angry steel. The depot shed behind them caught a bullet and splintered apart with a groan, collapsing into dust and old timber. There'd be no cover now. "Keep left!" Elias shouted, herding Nalin toward the riverbed's shallow dip. It wasn't much, but the land dipped just enough to break a line of fire. They slid down together, breath ragged. Riggs's voice called again, closer. Furious now. "You're throwing your life away for a ghost, Boone." Elias didn't answer. His rifle spoke for him, sending another shot into the rocks above, forcing the remaining rider to scramble. Then came a sudden whoop-knot, a yell of rage, but a sharp, rhythmic war cry that didn't belong to Riggs's men. From the ridge to the east, 3 mounted silhouettes appeared. Navajo riders. The first carried a bow. The second, a long rifle. The third raised a small piece of cloth-horn muslin, dyed with streaks of red and turquoise. Nalin gasped. "That's my brother's mark." Elias blinked. "They followed your trail. They protected it," she whispered. Riggs turned at the sound, his face blanching. His wounded arm hung limp, blood soaking through his coat. "This wasn't supposed to happen," he muttered, backing toward the slope. Elias rose from cover, rifle lowered now. "You wanted to bury the truth," he said, "but it's louder than bullets." The Navajo riders closed in. One dismounted and rushed to Nalan's side older than her, with the same fire in his gaze. "Little bird," he said in their tongue, voice cracking. She ran into his arms. Riggs raised his revolver with his good hand. Elias didn't hesitate. One clean shot. The gun dropped from Riggs's hand. He staggered, then collapsed in the dust alive, but defeated, stripped of the power that fed on fear and silence. The dust settled. The basin was still again. Elias approached Nalan and her brother, nodding with quiet respect. "You're safe now," he said. She looked up at him. "Number, we're seen now." She untied the pouch and handed it to her brother. "Give it to the ones who'll speak. Not just for us, but for all the ones they tried to forget." The man nodded and rode hard toward the east trail, toward the army, toward truth. Elias stood in the broken sunlight, shoulders heaving. He wasn't a hero, but today he hadn't been a coward. The sun hung low now, gold leaking across the scrubland like a farewell. Smoke from Riggs's ruined camp drifted over the ridge behind them, silent witness to a truth too long buried. Elias stood with Nalan at the riverbed's edge, where dry earth cracked beneath their feet. Her brother had vanished down the east trail, carrying the map, the names, the blood-stamped proof of what had been done. Elias looked to the west back toward the basin, the arches, the mountains that had hidden him for years. Part of him ached to return, to let it all settle into memory. But the girl beside him reminded him that silence no longer protected anyone. "Where will you go?" he asked softly. Nalan didn't answer right away. Her eyes scanned the land with the patience of someone who had learned to wait through storms. Then she said, "Where others still listen, where lies haven't finished killing." "Oh?" He nodded. It was enough. The remaining riders circled up, watching the horizon. One approached Elias with a small satchel simple, leather-bound, and stitched with blue thread. Inside was a turquoise pendant, smooth and warm from the rider's hands. "For you," the man said in broken English. She said, "You gave her your fire. She give you hers." Elias took the pendant, heavy with meaning. They mounted up again. Nalan swung behind her brother. Before riding off, she turned once more. "Your war isn't over," she said. Elias met her gaze. "Neither is yours." She smiled, not with joy, but something stronger, survival. Then the riders wheeled south, their silhouettes shrinking into the dying light. Elias stood alone. Again, but not hollow. He looked at the horizon, then down at his hands, weathered, scarred, but steady. He opened his fingers and let the dust slip through, like he was letting go of something nameless. Then he turned, walking back toward Luna. He didn't know what came next, Fort Bowie, or justice, or more dust and fire. But the trail was no longer empty, and the ghosts no longer silent. As he mounted and nudged Luna forward, the desert echoed only one thing back to him: footsteps that no longer ran. If you're like this video, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey. The sky the next morning bore no hint of the violence it had witnessed. Pale blue, stretched thin across the San Pedro Basin, as if the land itself had exhaled after holding its breath far too long. Elias reached Fort Bowie just past dawn, his shirt torn at the shoulder, dust caked thick in the folds of his hat. The sentry at the Gitaea, young corporal with eyes too clean for desert warfare, hesitated at the sight of him. But when Elias mentioned the name Riggs and dropped the blood-stained badge of the mercenary captain into his palm, the gates opened without another word. He didn't ask for a room, didn't seek medical attention. He simply handed the leather pouch to the base clerk with instructions. Straight to the provost, no detours. "This one's got names that scream." The clerk blinked, but took it, sensing something larger than himself. Elias turned back down the road before the dust of his boots could even settle. He didn't need to stay for the fallout. Let the officers unravel their own lies. Let the politicians choke on silence no longer bought. By noon, he was riding west toward hills that had no names on maps, just stories whispered among traders and widows. He passed old burn scars in the sagebrush, a rusted canteen wedged between roots, a single child's shoe, long faded and cracked. He didn't touch any of it, just rode past, heart heavy, but lighter somehow. Behind him, Nalen's words echoed still. Your war isn't over. No, it wasn't. But it was no longer a war of hiding. At a bend in the trail, he stopped beneath an old juniper tree. From his coat pocket, he took the turquoise pendant simple, smooth, shaped like a raindrop. He tied it to his saddle horn, where it caught the sun and blinked like memory. He didn't pray, but he whispered, for Samuel, for the boy in Dragoon, for her. Ugh! Then he mounted again, facing the long, dusted horizon. Somewhere ahead was another ghost needing rest. Another story no one dared tell. Elias Boone rode on, not as a fugitive, not as a soldier, but as something the desert hadn't seen in a long, long while. A man no longer running. 2 weeks passed before the letter arrived. Tied in twine, smudged with trail dust, and tucked into a folded scrap of hide bearing the Navajo clan mark. It found Elias at a way station near the Chiricahua foothills, a quiet spot where mail came late and coffee was always black. He opened it with calloused fingers, careful not to tear the script that flowed across the page in careful English. It was Nalen's handwriting. We crossed safely. The proof is now in hands that may yet honor it. The officers at Fort Bowie listened. At least one of them did. There will be inquiries, whispers in halls, the kind of silence that speaks louder than words. I do not know if it will bring justice, but it will bring questions. That is where change begins. They wanted to forget us. But now they must remember. Elias read it twice, then once more, slower. At the bottom, she had drawn something, a circle of stones with a single flame in the center, a hearth, a promise. Beneath it, 4 words. You are remembered too. He folded the letter and slipped it into the inside pocket of his duster. Outside the way station, the world turned gold again the hour before sundown when the desert stopped burning and started breathing. Children played near the watering trough. A Navajo trader unloaded baskets near the general store, and no one flinched. It wasn't peace, but it wasn't war either. A woman older, wrapped in a shawl of indigo and worn wool, watched Elias from a bench. When he passed, she didn't speak, only nodded slowly, eyes resting on the turquoise pendant at his saddle. Respect. Quiet. No questions. Elias returned the nod. He knew now that legacy wasn't carved in stone or shouted from pulpits. Sometimes it lived in a letter, a scar, a silence, no longer ashamed. He mounted Luna and turned west again. The land ahead was empty, but it no longer felt so. The ghosts that once walked beside him had grown quiet, not gone, but content. And as the wind curled through the dry grass, carrying echoes of riders long buried and songs almost forgotten, Elias Boone pressed on man against the fading light, carrying the weight of stories that would not die. It was near sundown when Elias reached the old homestead. The adobe walls still stood, sun-bleached and solid. The corral gate creaked in the same rhythm it always had, and the apple tree bare now, more memory than fruit, cast a long, reaching shadow toward the porch. He hadn't meant to come back, but his horse had known the way. Or maybe it was something else that guided them, something that moved not by maps, but by memory. Elias dismounted and ran his hand along the porch rail. The smooth wood bore the grooves of time and touched Samuel's work, every nail driven with care, every beam a choice. Inside, dust had settled thick over the hearth, the table, the lantern still hanging by a frayed rope. He didn't light it. He didn't need to. The light outside was enough. He sat in the old rocking chair. For the first time in years, it didn't groan beneath him like protest, just a soft creak, like it too remembered. From his pocket, he drew Nalen's letter again, held it in his lap. On the table beside him, he placed the turquoise pendant. It caught the last rays of sunlight, casting a blue glow over the grain of the wood like a flicker of water in the desert. He stayed that way for a long time, breathing, remembering, and forgiving. Not because the past had changed, but because the weight of carrying it alone no longer made sense. Outside, an owl hooted low and steady from the rafters of the barn. Somewhere in the hills, coyotes called to one another across the dusk. Not in warning, in recognition, Elias stood. There were fences to mend, water lines to clear. Maybe he'd fix the window with the crack in it, maybe not. He didn't need to start over. He just needed to live truthfully, and that was enough. As night fell, the homestead stood quiet under a sky full of stars. No monument marked this place. No headlines would speak his name, but stories, the kind that passed between generations and sat close to the fire, would remember not just Elias Boone, but the girl who carried the truth, the riders who answered her call, the day when silence cracked open and something honest broke through. And somewhere, in the land between dusk and dawn, a whisper rode the wind. Kindness, once given, never dies. For those who've lived long enough to know that scars don't always fade and that sometimes silence tells the truest stories, this tale may feel like a mirror. Not just of the Old West, but of our own hearts. The creak of saddles, the cold wind off the plains, the quiet dignity of men and women trying to do right in a world built wrong. These aren't just details, they're memories. Perhaps that's why true Wild West stories still matter, because they remind us that redemption isn't loud, justice isn't always swift, and real faith isn't about never falling, but about rising again, quietly, stubbornly, with grace. If you've ever lost someone, carried regret, or simply looked back on the long trail of your life and wondered if it meant something, this story was written for you. And maybe, just maybe, like John Hawk Miller, we're all still learning to rebuild what we helped break, one act of kindness at a time.